I'm Chris Viajoli. This is actually the last speaker of this term for the Surveillance and Democracy series, seminar that I've been organizing with Professor Chandra of the Law School. And we're really happy to welcome in Brunton here, and we've brought our Aberdeen crowd together for you. One of your advisors and your external examiner are here for you. Finn is a professor of media, culture, and communication in the NYU Steinhardt School of Media, Culture, and Communication. It's really difficult to sort of, and a challenge for me to succinctly characterize Finn's work, since he is as prolific as he is eccentric in his topics. He writes on topics from dwarf forces to cryptocurrency, Bitcoin, the history of alternative currencies, 4chan, the hacker group Anonymous, WikiLeaks, kleptography, piracy, Chris Marker, Stanislav's Lem, and Walter Benjamin, in venues ranging from The Guardian, The Wall Street Journal, Le Monde Politique, The Scientific American, to art form, representation, and radical philosophy, which he was a frequent contributor. He's the author of 2 books. The first is Spam, A Shadow History of the Internet, and it was the winner of the 2013 Prose Award in Computing and Information Sciences. Beautifully written. I suggest you all check it out. Spam's etymology is a story of transitive and mutable meanings. It mirrors in the negative form, tells us that of unity, pejorative, the latter is persuasive, sharply exploitative, rather than vaguely beneficial. Finn argues that spam must be understood as a historical phenomenon. It starts with 1970 Monty Python sketch, Vikings chanting spam, 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 overwhelming conversation in a restaurant that was reenacted endlessly in the forums of the early internet, but quickly mutates from this automatic duplication on the early non-commercial computer networks that became the internet. Through the 1995 to 2003 dot-com boom that gave rise to spam's entrepreneurs and the first efforts to regulate it. And to the more recent incarnation from 2003 to the present, the war of algorithms, where the war between spam and anti-spam slips over into the logic of publicity. And this leads us to his most recent book he co-authored with Helen Nussbaum, who was here last week, entitled Obfuscation, A User's Guide to Privacy and Protest. With this book, they both start by telling us, we need to start a revolution, but not a big revolution. A humble revolution, full of dishonesty, full of dead ends, intricacy, waste, and uncertainty. Well, maybe at first it will be a small revolution. I think today he's going to build off of that in his very felicitous way that he has. So please join me in welcoming Finn Brunton.
Thank you so much for coming. It's a great pleasure and honor to address you all, especially at the last talk of this term, an incredible roster of speakers. So just to say this up top, Helen and I sort of, when we were talking about our talks following immediately one after the other, we divided up the responsibilities where Helen got to be the responsible one, who would sort of lay out the thoughtful case around obfuscation and what it means and how it works, and I would get to be the irresponsible one, who would bring in larger, potentially stranger, more difficult issues. This is a talk that's very much about some work in progress that both builds on obfuscation, but also hopefully opens some new avenues for discussion. It's called Felicitous Questions, a term that is going to become meaningful in just a second. It's in 6 parts, as follows. Notice that we only get around to obfuscation in part 3, but I promise it'll be worth it once we're there. And it actually opens with something like a shameful confession, which is that I am not actually I don't really have that much to say about privacy as such. Don't tell Helen, please. Because I take contemporary privacy very seriously as a matter for activism and as a practical matter for especially vulnerable and precarious communities. But for me, privacy was always a way into another set of questions, a very fruitful and rapid avenue into another set of questions. In particular, questions about trying to technologically model social and political concepts. I'd like to discuss some of those with you today and think about them as ways that can open alternatives for us to exactly the zero-sum game between privacy and security, which is so much the topic of this series, to see if they can give us venues for thinking that will lead elsewhere than the sort of saddle point in the maximin strategy between the opposition of privacy and security. And I'd like to frame this historically, because historical work is a lot of what I do. My friend and colleague Elaine Newman, who is a brilliant scholar of personal computing, describes the challenge of the work that she does as not getting history right, but getting history more. Not adding some neglected figure to the historical pedestal, but rather of filling out the history in precisely a way that makes pedestals unnecessary. Partially by finding the people, the actors, the technologies that didn't conceive of themselves historically in ways that correspond with our present understanding. To tell the many overlapping stories that make our account of the past more accurate at the same time that it may make it less coherent. So part of what I'm going to try to do here is tell a story about privacy and computers that has very few people in it. Because I suspect that the baggage of people and their private lives is what's really slowing down our ability to think about this. It's sort of a provocation. This whole thing is going to be a provocation. So this story that I'm going to tell, the story about privacy in which people almost never appear, opens with the compression fracture that is at the very heart of network computing in the modern day. By the way, I apologize for the deep violet color of everything, but just roll with it. It's the color of the past, right? It's like faded videotape. It's the compression fracture at the very history, at the very beginning of network computing that lay between the culture of academia and the culture of the military. And to some degree, business, but we're going to mostly be talking about academia and military. Because of course, academia is a sharing and citation-driven reputation economy, where even the secrets are publicized. And this is my tip of the hat to a fantastic piece that Mario wrote about the process by which scientists, in this case Galileo, would have to essentially register secrets in public without disclosing their nature as secrets. This was an anagram, which actually allowed Galileo to both provide proof of a certain time of having made a particular discovery without having to declare the discovery, in such a way that he could also walk away from the discovery if it turned out to not actually be a discovery. And this for me is very much at like the heart of the academic process. Even the secrets are things that are handled in public. And part of the genius of a figure who is going to recur throughout the story that I'm going to tell you today, von Neumann, was his incredible ability to dance between the necessary secrecy of the military and the necessary publicity, the necessary structure of public life, public thought that makes up academia. A very complex dance indeed when you consider the fact that this guy who's next to him on the wall of Los Alamos was a spy. Complicated issues that had to be managed. And the core of this dance, for purposes of starting our conversation today, is von Neumann's open circulation of the EDVAC drafts, right? Of the documents that mark the beginning of the widespread use of electronic computation. We still use, most of us, machines that run on something like the von Neumann architecture, as it's called. And it was very much based on finding ways to circulate documents, to get the word out as much as possible, to keep this public. In this case, by describing the underlying logic without necessarily going too much into the hardware considerations, which still matters in national security, spreading these materials around with some specific stated goals to find ways to be public, to be open, to be widely available. I certainly intend to do my part to keep as much of this field in the public domain from the patent point of view as I can, he wrote to Stan Frankel in 1946. And then in his deposition about the circulation of the EDVAC documents, he gave this as his goal in order to further the development of the art of building high-speed computers. This is something that is so much at the core of a particular way of doing computation academically that I want to highlight it here, not least because the people who actually followed the rules and did much of the work about the genesis of electronic computing, Eckert and Mauchly there, are sadly much less widely known, precisely because of the fact that from their perspective, von Neumann stole the glory by getting everything published widely and circulated widely, while they were abiding by the careful rules of keeping all of this secret, of finding ways to maintain some control over the flow of this information, because they understood their relationship to the military culture of computing. So you have this example on the academic side, right, of von Neumann, this extremely significant figure in the Cold War who's trying as widely as possible to publicize these crucial discoveries. And then there is no better icon of the collision that is about to take place between computers and the military attitude than this trench in upstate New York. I've wanted to write a piece about this trench for a long time. This trench is one of the cable lays for something called the Autobahn system, which was part of the parallel universe of Cold War telephony for military use. Because the US strategic community decided that rather than trying to figure out some system that would allow them to work with the phone company or trust the phone company, just built their own phone network, because why not? Because that's the sort of thing that you can do. There's a couple of key differences. It has a built-in override system. It's called the red phone. You can see one of them here. This is in the presidential bunker immediately after 9/11. It's not actually red, but the buttons are red. And the buttons are there because the Autobahn system allows certain handsets to override any other calls. So in the event of a true crisis, someone who's in the National Command Authority can automatically call anyone else. They built this whole vast architecture while keeping it essentially a secret, working with civilian engineers and various internal groups, sworn to secrecy to construct a global telephone system of incredible complexity that will allow you to call a specific phone on a specific desk on any US military base on Earth, which also included its own billing system, because of course it's the US military, so they have to build a giant parallel billing bureaucracy without anyone knowing about it. Until, of course, eventually the time came when it ceased to be useful and became more and more widely disclosed. For me, the icon of the intersection between these two processes, the process of the management of secrecy and the management of publicity, lies in the fact that von Neumann, as he was dying, the only orderlies who could be near him in the hospital were all from the Air Force. They had top secret clearance lest he babble something classified in his pain and delirium. And poor John Bigelow, who was a dear friend of von Neumann's, actually had to get his Q clearance, which was top secret Department of Energy clearance, restored so that he could go sit by his friend's bedside and read to him. And as von Neumann knew that he was dying, this is from the last talk he gave standing up, as he knew that, that his time was running away, he became very valedictory and started to sketch out future large-scale plans, future problems to think about in the work of doing computing. And this was a sentence that I'm going to come back to. Please hold this thought in mind. Divide all processes into those things which can better be done by machines and those which can better be done by humans, and then invent methods by which to pursue the two. So at the very outset of computation, we have this deep-seated struggle over both the hardware and what the hardware is for, over the nature of openness and publicity and academic structure and the nature of military secrecy, which brings us to part 2, and what should have been the title of this talk. Computer technology and surveillance, right? It's kind of the theme in many ways of this series. It's a very crucial, salient topic. But this title, I've cut it carefully out of context here, is from an article in this issue of Computers and People from September 1975. It's actually by a guy named Paul Armour, who's from the Stanford Computer Center, worked at numerical analysis of RAND. And he wrote this article in 1975. Thatcher took office, right? The Khmer Rouge took power. Patty Hearst was arrested in San Francisco. This article is 45 years old as of relatively recently. Disco is still a thing. And it's based on Armour's congressional testimony. And it's not that it was prescient, even though it is, as an article. That's not why I'm showing it to you today. I'm showing it to you because it's boring. Because all the familiar issues are there. Hacking and exploits, the application of information processing tools to collating personal data and building automated dossiers, the use of universal identifiers and identity theft, wiretapping, speech recognition, state surveillance, even, very dear to my heart in my current research, a lot of thought about electronic funds transfer systems and their capture or use or theft by advertisers or the government. And yet this article just turned 45 years old. And the beauty of reading it now is that everything else in this magazine is a historical curiosity now, at best. What will become of word processing in the computerized office? It's very exciting. Telnet and packet communications. They're going to start building public networks to allow computers to connect together. This article actually precedes so many different things. It precedes our current understanding of the use of the idea of hacking. This is from the piece itself, where he calls it a favorite pastime of bright students to attempt to penetrate the computer, and they succeed all the time. This article precedes TCP/IP, or rather, it precedes the actual application of TCP/IP. This is the plaque marking the bar below Stanford, where they drove the packet radio van to stage the initial TCP/IP project. Part of what I love, and this really speaks to the early days of the internet, is that this is the context in which this plaque hangs. You know? Not the Pentagon, not the depths of a military base or the hallowed halls of Stanford. It's next to the pinball machine at this biker bar. But nonetheless, this article, right? This article, which covers so many of our contemporary anxieties and concerns, beats this event. This article precedes by a year the production of Diffie, Hellman, Merkel. It beats, I mean, no one even knew about the GCHQ research that was going on in the development of public key cryptography, but it beats that as well. Forget advertising, forget the web, forget all of the things that we think of as changing our privacy landscape. This article is still, to a depressing degree, completely tediously accurate, except in one respect. The parts that are actually really historically painful to read now are not the parts where he's wrong, because he is in fact shockingly prescient, or not the fact where he's like sort of hand-waving giant hypotheticals that don't come to pass because he's giving congressional testimony for straining irresponsible. It's the fact where he's overly optimistic about us, where he assumes we're going to be wiser and do a better job of organizing the future of privacy on the internet than we actually turn out to do. And my goal here is precisely to set this up for you, not to give you a bunch of hot takes about now half-century-old questions, but instead to look at other possible avenues, other things that could get us away from the traditional dyadic structure of security and privacy, of publicity and secrecy. And to start by talking a little bit about what drew me to the obfuscation project and how that can sort of help frame the other avenue I'd like to suggest that we follow. So I wrote a book, as Chris very kindly mentioned during my introduction, about the history of spam. And the spam book was about a bunch of things. It was about writing the history of the network through its failures and so on. But the really interesting thing about the book for me, the thread in the book that was the most compelling, was about the bizarre arms race between spam platforms and filtering systems, between systems that were meant to reach human readers and systems that were meant to figure out what human readers were looking for so that they could block messages that weren't salient. After the early 2000s, spammers weren't trying to trick people into reading and responding, or rather they were trying to do so only as a second-order effect. The goal of their system was instead to convince spam filtering systems of the humanness of the messages that were being sent. The only way to make money was by sending messages in enormous volume. The only way to do that volume was to automate. The automated messages were being caught by something that was administering an ad hoc Turing test. So the filters were trying to get registered as false negatives, as spam messages passing as legitimate, by pretending to be human enough to beat that system. When the user would flag the message, the anti-spam filter would evolve, and the spam message sending system would evolve. And what you ended up with was an extraordinary event. You can see not just in email spam, but in link spam and all these different systems, for which increasingly the human user, the human person seeing the message, was a second or third order effect of the system at work. And indeed, with things like link spamming systems, which are designed to fool Google's PageRank algorithm into valuing certain links higher than others, their apparatus was never meant to be seen by humans at all. They were generating enormous numbers of synthetic actors, of of algorithms acting in blogs, in wikis, and so on, to generate material which humans would instantly recognize as false. But the humans were never meant to see it. It was meant solely for Google's spiders. So what you have is a system in which the human almost never appears. Instead, it is trying to model itself based on PageRank's model of what humans think are interesting. So there's a multi-layered process happening here, an ongoing arms race that would produce many different absurd and fascinating and sometimes rather entertaining outcomes. These are book spam. These are projects that are designed to game Amazon's ranking system. These books don't actually exist until you buy them, and then the system scrapes a bunch of keywords relative to them, dumps them into a print-on-demand copy, and sends one to you for a couple $100. And of course, they seem ridiculous, and they are ridiculous, because they aren't really necessarily meant for people at all, except essentially by a vanishingly small percentage, by something that almost approaches a kind of accident. And there was no great sophistication to any of these systems. There didn't need to be yet. But the core of it was already here, which is looking at something that is understanding the alien dynamics of something that is not addressing itself to people, or is addressing itself to people in only the most remote way, that is actually largely addressing itself to other machines. And this is the similar thing that drew me to the process of looking at obfuscation. I don't know if Helen told you the canonical sort of story now of how she, canonical sounds very self-satisfied, but I mean the story of how she and I came to work on obfuscation together, which was that she was telling me about Track Me Not, a program that I believe she's described and discussed already. And she and I were sitting in her office together, and she was outlining Track Me Not to me. And I've been doing a bunch of research into radar, and in particular into the dropping of chaff as a way of defeating radar. Dropping things that will produce signals that look like the signals of planes, that look like the pings that planes produce, to make it harder to use anti-aircraft weaponry while they're in the air. And the reason why I thought of this was precisely that chaff is something that only works under extremely limited circumstances, right? It's not something that functions indefinitely. It lasts for only about 10 minutes, depending on your altitude, until it settles down. No human observer would be fooled by this, but it's perfectly clear to what the machine is built to find. And we found numerous other examples of this. And the book is as it exists, but there's a thread in it that I really want to draw out for us to think about privacy today, to think about kind of cracking this dyad of privacy and security, which is that there were these fairly obvious examples of obfuscation. Things like chaff or legal over-disclosure, where people request some set of documents and you give them way, way more documents under the pretense of helpfulness to slow them down, to make the process of discovery more of a pain. But the things that really interested me in obfuscation, just like the things that really interest me in the history of spam, are examples that have to do with selectively identifying kinds of machines and kinds of humans, and including or excluding them from being able to read them. Being able to identify things that are well-suited to particular kinds of analysis, and identifying and targeting those, or trying to sort of block and stymie those. Being able to recognize that there are actually multiple actors involved in the process, and most of them aren't human, and therefore being able to figure out how to work with that, how to game that, how to take advantage of that. And that's where many of the other, to me, more fascinating examples start to come to the fore. Things like code obfuscation, right? Where code is something where you can't not let people examine your code under certain circumstances, right? So the solution is to come up with a mechanism that will still work for the machine, that will still in some sense be readable to the machine, but will be as opaque as possible to the human. And one of my favorite examples of this is substitution systems that will replace capital O's with zeros, which the computer will have no problem parsing, but which can lead the human, as they're trying to sort things out, into being led down many blind alleys. Similarly, one of the examples that I found really striking as we were sort of evolving this was a process called like farming, which is basically giant groups of humans that are registered on Facebook or other social networks that you can buy blocks of likes from, right? You need something to be liked up on Facebook, so you pay for some large population of people to sit there and just like it over and over and over again. Obviously, it is trivial for Facebook to identify people who never do anything except like some small family of products endlessly. So instead, they have to come up with a system, a quite elaborate system, so that the humans, with the assistance of bots and other software tools, can like a random range of things within which the liking of the things they're being paid to like can somewhat hide itself, can be masked, can begin to disappear. Which again, is not about doing something that's addressed to humans. It's about reverse engineering what Facebook thinks human activity looks like, coming up with a mock of that, and then within that being able to accomplish your goals. Just to take an example that will take us a little bit outside of obfuscation for a second, though, of a similar phenomenon. Something very dear to me personally. E13B, the font on your checks. E13B, a font which is developed so that humans can read it. We can make sense of what these numbers are. But that the numbers also, they're not shaped this way for optical character recognition. They're shaped this way so that the particular layout of the magnetic ink in the printing will be readable by check scanning machines. So this is a system which is simultaneously addressed to the human eye and to a very specific set of technical systems, but in very different ways, in ways that will allow it to accomplish particular goals. And what I'm getting to with all of this is to suggest that one of the really interesting things for us to think about in terms of privacy is to think about the degree to which privacy now has less and less to do with people, with human analysis, and more to do with the ways our activities look to very large software systems. So Ken Wark, Mackenzie Wark, has talked about the unexpected side of the collapse of privacy on the network. Not just the terrifying, targeted, Orwellian violations of personal autonomy for small numbers of dissidents, activists, and minorities worldwide, but the indifference with regard to everyone else. Because in fact, your individual identity is in many ways the least interesting thing about you, for purposes that range from developing better advertising dossiers to targeting missiles from predator drones. The human contributions, the human activity, is in many ways more useful in aggregate than it is as the outcome of any particular individual life, as fodder for deep learning systems, predictive text algorithms, and translation engines. The sort of vision, again, staying with our sort of first thread, the vision on the academic side of computation, of networks of computers as being something that would spur the interaction of humans, that would spur the interaction and augmentation of humans. This is from Doug Engelbart's mother of all demos, of course, one of the great early demonstrations of human-to-human collaboration over computer networks. That still remains, but it has become increasingly the froth, I would argue, while I'm being irritatingly provocative, the froth on top of the much more significant process, which is the genesis of software systems for which our aggregate activity is of much greater importance than the things that we might do as individual people. The information that we give up as groups or about others in the course of our own activities is much more salient. So if we are talking about online privacy, then surely we should be talking about social media. But if we're going to talk with any clarity about contemporary social media, we need to talk about what's actually happening there quantitatively. And the kind of activity that people early in the history of the network thought, active participants forming a new disembodied community with their minds interacting, is playing a smaller and smaller role in that process. Because of course there's spam, lots and lots of spam. There's always been. This is one of my favorite slides where it doesn't necessarily, you can be spam while being a human, you can be human-like but also be spam. But far larger and more complex than that are systems like JTRIG in the UK and Operation Earnest Voice in the US, which we know through the Snowden disclosures, which seek to analyze, manage, manipulate, and disrupt online conversation through several methods, most notably through the mass generation of personae. Bots doesn't quite do them justice, that can engage in online social activity. They can shift sentiments, quietly spread propaganda, amplify messages, give things the impression of being trending or significant, game online polls, fill social activities online with noise, which is one of our examples of obfuscation used on behalf of powerful actors. We have several instances of this where governments have deliberately flooded social networks with noise to stop a particular discussion from happening. And the really significant thing here, the thing that I want to highlight about this, is that this sort of activity, whether we're talking about something like Putin's troll army, with their extraordinarily sophisticated process of managing conversations about Ukraine and Syria, or Gamergate trolls driving women off the internet, all of these different groups are a mix of humans and artificial systems. And in many ways, the distinction is becoming increasingly irrelevant. The really salient point is that it doesn't matter if it's a human or a machine. The goal of certain kinds of software development in this space is to make them functionally indistinguishable. And I would highlight here Lily Arani's fantastic work on Mechanical Turk, and all of the effort that goes into making the Mechanical Turk workers seem like, as the advertising slogan has it, artificial intelligence. In a certain way, those of you who are familiar with Cyril's concept of the Chinese room, you look at that and it actually looks a lot like a knowledge worker factory floor. You just feed data into it, the data does something, and then you get results, and it doesn't matter if it's a person or a machine. The gap keeps narrowing between social network bots and what Anna Jane calls meat puppets, which is her term for people who join internet discussions solely to influence them, but more broadly is a fantastic term for how we can be understood as objects that produce information, propagate memes, respond to automated notifications, and in all other ways become essentially the felt glove with the glue-on googly eyes that sits on the limb of a vast and intricate machine. Brian Eno has this wonderful quote saying that cultural objects have value is like saying that telephones have conversations, which was, amusing. You may or may not agree, but this is also a quote from the 1990s. And now our telephones have conversations all the time. Many of them are not necessarily conversations that we would recognize. They might be conversations that have to do with disclosing our activities or our movements. They might be conversations with other phones, or with stingray systems, or with antennas. And naturally, we also have conversations in a literal sense with our phones. Whether we're talking about Siri or Cortana or customer service, we are often in a very quotidian way either sharing information with or being directly affected by systems in which humans don't need to be in the loop at all. Now, if you want to become a music star, it's crucial that your videos, your YouTube videos, your songs have tons of YouTube views. And there are good ways to get tons of YouTube views, which involve a blend of human and non-human activity. Again, just as a practical matter. I'm not even going to comment on this next slide, which to me is just like having something shot into my brain. But this is the marketing technology landscape of 2015.
Thank you.
Many of these systems interoperate. Many of these systems kick in directly at the moment that you load a particular image or enter something into a text box, or God help us all, click on an actual ad. And many of these systems are moving the information around, again, in ways that have very little to do with what we might think of as human-driven surveillance or analysis. And the technologies that rely increasingly on the machines rather than the humans are, of course, having their own spin-offs. This is a really fantastic question to be asking on the part of law enforcement, and we can also ask it of them. And it's one where, again, just to sort of reinforce this point, one of the crucial outcomes of this is the indistinguishability, is the degree to which the humans and the machines begin to blend together. This is a marvelous dialogue from quite recently between a developer and M, Facebook's personal assistant system, which claims that humans train me, but it's not entirely clear what the relationship is between the humans and some kind of interesting deep learning system. He wrote a beautiful post about this that is essentially a detective story, as he tries to get M to either tell him what's going on or to give him a call or something. The fact that it's a challenge, the fact that he actually has to do this kind of anti-Turing test to figure out what's going on, is, I think, very indicative of our current situation. Now, all that I've said so far can seem like the confirmation of some rather old news. Turing's landmark argument from what he called various disabilities in computing, machinery, and intelligence. And of course, Turing's argument, in its extremely simple form, is that if you think machines are bad, you should see people. That rather than judging machines by an artificial standard, you should see what activity for you constitutes the activity of intelligence, and then apply it to other things around you and see what passes. And when we begin to look at it in this light, we can see that, in fact, we pass the Turing test in all kinds of ways now. People give their credit card information away to a seductive chatbot. People engage in all kinds of horrible information driven purely by interaction design. The CAPTCHA systems to distinguish humans from bots are in very difficult straits. And indeed, a human user can be indistinguishable from a bot under many circumstances and in many different situations. And to link this back to privacy, we are in the process of building deeply alien architectures and systems on a vast scale whose content we partially constitute. And it is in the context of those systems that we are now communicating, and that I suspect we should reevaluate what we mean by privacy in that context. Foucault has this famous phrase, in political thought and analysis, we still have not cut off the head of the king. And I'm worried that in our analysis of privacy, we still think that the king has a head. We still assume that there are humans and human agendas there, when we should be perhaps evaluating this under very different meanings. So I'm a little bit short on time, so I'll move very quickly through something I just want to present as an illustrative case, a case of great interest to me personally. This is the Natanz nuclear uranium enrichment facility in Iran, the facility that was hit by the Stuxnet war. It's an urban legend. I don't believe this is actually true, but it was from an email from someone reporting the work at the facility, that later on, following the initial Stuxnet hack, they were hacked again, and someone test played AC/DC's Thunderstruck over the PA system. And I mention this because in Toronto, when the Ashley Madison website was hacked, or rather Avid Life Media, their parent company, when people came in the morning and turned on their computers to see the warning message left by the hackers, the computers actually started playing Thunderstruck, which is now migrated from being a made-up apocryphal activity into a real sort of hacker calling card. You all are, I'm sure, thoroughly familiar with the Ashley Madison story. I just want to highlight one crucial element of it, one really salient point for thinking about how our understanding of privacy, I think, needs to begin to shift now, which is that, let us say that you are just thinking about having an affair. Ashley Madison has beautifully assembled user interface design to carry you along. As soon as you select something, you don't even click that button, it automatically carries you to the profile page. And as soon as you fill this out, and as soon as you click I agree, and ignore the we do not perform any criminal background checks note down there at the bottom, you're moved along with incredible speed through selecting a photo, through seeing your matches, and then within a matter of minutes of you having set up your profile, you get a message. In this case, from 39 and Lonely. 39 and Lonely 1. You get a message, you reply to the message, you write out some text, and then when you click send a message, you get to the payment page. Here you have to put in your credit card information to buy credits, to communicate. And then you do. You send a message, maybe nothing comes of it, almost certainly nothing comes of it for reasons we'll get to in a second. And then years go by, you forget you did this, you're filled with regrets. The Ashley Madison hack happens, it's in the news, you're freaking out. You Google, check if you are in the Ashley Madison database. You come to this page, you put in your email address. It tells you maybe yes, maybe no. They don't necessarily have any actual access to the backend data because they don't care. Because what happens when you put your email address in here or someone else's is that a few hours later you get this. This is an extortion message. This was saved by the Toronto police force. The extortion message announces that your data has been leaked by the Ashley Madison hack. They have all your information. They're going to send it to people using social network information about you, unless you give them payment in Bitcoin to keep quiet. And then they give you the instructions for doing that, including a charming little explanation about why you shouldn't use Facebook. Now, I want to give you this quick walkthrough. We've gone all the way from temptation through some kind of moral or emotional violation to extortion, criminal activity. Not once has a human been involved with this who wasn't the user. The automatic message that you got was from what's called a conversion bot, which Ashley Madison builds to get men involved because it's almost entirely men. There are very few women on Ashley Madison, which is a problem for running a site like this. So instead they just have automated women who get men to pony up, to put their money in, to stay involved in the system. The extortion system runs automatically. It doesn't even check. It assumes that if you're putting in your email address, you're worried about this, and therefore they can probably get some money out of you. From end to end, this entire process, this horrific privacy disaster, doesn't actually need humans involved at all, except for you. Now, in the interest of getting to the actual question part, I'm going to skip through. I always overdo it with talks, especially in the context of being able to be part of a series like this, because I really want to say everything. But the core of the close of this talk was to circle back. This is the Carinae Nebula seen through Google's Deep Dream system, which is a deep learning feature set that's trained on dogs, and then looks for dogs in every image. To circle back through this idea that we still are, and this is one of the things that Helen and I often disagree about to some degree, we are still often thinking about framing the concept of privacy in human terms. And just to close with the question that I started with, and to sort of stay in the spirit of the 1970s, this is Terry Winograd's dissertation about Shirley. Shirley was a natural text, natural language recognition system, and the idea was that this would beat the Turing test. This would be a brilliant artificial intelligence breakthrough because you could tell Shirley what you wanted it to do in a domain of geometric shapes called box world, and then it would do those things, and then you could, for example, ask, why is there now a pyramid on top of that cube? And Shirley could say, because you told me to put it there. And this was all very impressive. It really was. It was an amazing breakthrough. And then Winograd ultimately realized that this was not the way forward. Because, as he put it, humans do not analyze syntactic variables for truth or falsehood. Humans engage in felicitous questions. We have a deep and very human sense of what we mean when we say things and what the context is, socially and physically, within which we say them. He uses a number of famous examples. Among them, if I ask, is there water in the refrigerator? What am I asking? I'm probably asking, could you get me some water from the refrigerator? I'm probably not asking, is there water in the molecules? Or I'm sorry, is there water in the cells of the apple that's sitting on the third shelf? We understand that part of the work of making better natural language systems is overcoming those kinds of complexities. But there's another component to the nature of our felicitous questions, which is that when we are having conversations, we understand what Helen calls context. We understand the relationships between friends and friends, friends and family, people and doctors, people and priests, people and lawyers. We understand all of these different sets of relationships and what we expect from them. It's truly interesting to watch as online systems begin to learn some of these approaches. But I would be really interested, and this is just something that I would like to unpack with all of you, I would be really interested in how we can start to think about big data and the analysis of big data from the side of the machines rather than the side of the people, to understand how it is that we actually look to the system that we have built. And I'm going to skip 25 minutes of talking about the history of communicating with alien intelligence and how it relates to the history of programming computers. I would love to discuss this with anybody who would like to talk with me about it afterwards, because as it turns out, there are many similar classes of problems between the two, and in the 1950s, they actually overlapped for a substantial period. But to instead get to the very close, which is to ask if we can start to think about these problems precisely because, and this is my big closing couple of sentences, I want to force us to think about dimensions of the analysis that we have around our privacy and around our personal information that might otherwise escape us because of the way in which we anthropomorphize things. Areas that we need to reevaluate more urgently than ever, not necessarily because we are in dialogue with artificial intelligence, but because we are nonetheless building alien orders around us. And those are the things that are surveilling us through our search queries, through our webcams, through our satellites. And the ways in which they change the rules about the nature of privacy are things that I would love for us to be able to have more dialogue about. So thank you for letting me kind of provoke you here, and welcome any questions or discussion.
So I want to return to aliens and the minute part about aliens. So Julius said, maybe Snowden, I'm not sure, maybe it's Snowden who said that the use of encryption will have the consequence that aliens will not be able to find us anymore.
Oh, yes, yes.
And so because the data stream that we produce will now presumably be randomized in a particular way, it will not suggest any kind of order that would be indicative of intelligence. So I'm just wondering, that's a view from the alien as opposed to a view either from the computer or the other person. It's a fascinating move to ask the question of how we examine this from the perspective of the data talking to each other.
Yeah. Oh, that's an enormously interesting question. I know it's something that, ironically, almost everyone involved in this sort of contemporary encryption landscape or activist landscape has had thoughts about this. Assange wrote a fantastic early piece about broadcasting encrypted messages into space. And yes, Snowden and Assange have both talked about, Snowden in particular has addressed the problem that presumably a superior civilization will be encrypting all of their transmissions, and that's why SETI hasn't worked yet, right? Because it's just going to be indistinguishable in one way or another from cosmic background radiation or something to that effect. And I want to actually highlight one particular thing about that, which is part of what was, for me, a striking thing of thinking about the alienness of these systems relative to our intentions or understandings, which is that the history of people, this is from the mathematician Hans Freudenthal, who also has a really interesting role in the history of artificial intelligence and computing. I was very close with Marvin Minsky. Freudenthal developed an elaborate project called Linkos, which was going to be a language that would be broadcast entirely with binary pulses into deep space, but which, as you received it, would allow you to eventually unpack not just all of mathematics, but many more complex concepts. And he highlights something that has come up with almost all of these examples, which is the inevitable assumption that the logical process of developing extraterrestrial communication must necessarily entail a moral order. So bizarrely, many of these hyper-rational people who develop these systems assume that the aliens are Kantians. They like to stage little dramas for them in their communication to show them what our highest moral expression is, so the aliens will get it that we're good people like them. In the same way, I love the idea on the part of Snowden that a superior civilization would naturally be encrypting everything. Of course. Why wouldn't they? As opposed to the fact that I would assume that if we look at our own trajectory, the first thing we would receive from deep space would be advertising. the radiation of, and indeed, because we ourselves have broadcast mostly advertising, actual serious attempts to communicate with extraterrestrial life are relatively rare compared with ad stunts in which, we broadcast Doritos messages through the Victoria dish. But it's to say that again, there's a sense in which we tend to assume that a moral order will necessarily follow from the adoption of a particular technology. So, and this is an area that this is a little bit of a dicier area to generalize about, but one of the really interesting things about the history of cryptographic activism, especially in the 1980s and 1990s, was the kind of struggle over what it meant to use cryptography widely, and what kind of society this was going to bring about, and whether we wanted that society and what that society would look like. And there's often a tendency, there's an excellent set of two pieces called Whatever Happened to the Crypto Dream that includes a certain amount of history about this, that circles around the question of whether or not the adoption of a new technology would effectively change the people adopting it, would sort of make them better for some value of better, would make the people who adopted also particular political or social goals and ideals. So does that make sense as a, yes, yeah.
Mark?
Sophie, I have a profoundly confused question.
This was a profoundly confusing talk in many ways. Yes.
So I was thinking when you were showing the airplane dropping chaff to confuse the radar, right? So it seems like you are differentiating your notion of obfuscation from camouflage.
Yes.
Right. So it says camouflage is when you try to make yourself disappear, as opposed to instead actively creating traces to send the people searching for you elsewhere.
Yeah.
Right. And by the way, the airplane example refutes what I am thinking. But I'll ask you anyway. So it looks like actually temporality seems to have a lot to do with these two modes, because in camouflage, you assume that somebody is looking at you at that time, right? So you want to disappear. You don't want to do anything funny because actually they'll see you, right? If you try to, create any trace to derail the search, you would actually attract attention. Right? So you want to be minimalist. You want to disappear, right? Because they're looking at you. Instead, the second mode, the obfuscation, seems to be based on the assumption that you can create a lot of false traces when they're not looking. Traces that they're going to find after. Right? So the example would be, very simple example, where, cowboy movies, a posse is going after somebody at night, the guy lets the horse go, so they don't see the horse running by itself. The next morning they see the prints, right? So the obfuscation happened when those guys are not watching, right? So it looks like, in a sense, the obfuscation seems to be based on the assumption that the panopticon has gaps. Meaning it may see everything, but not all the time. That there must be gaps in which you can create your fake traces. Because otherwise, if there are no gaps, then you can only camouflage.
Yeah. Yeah, no, well, so there's
So, but the airplane
no, well, so no, there's two thoughts that I'd like to put out to this, and actually, wonderfully, I think your question has very much helped me kind of clarify this work in progress talk in terms of how I'm presenting it now, which is that, I've long had an obsession with the history of camouflage, and in particular, with the fact that camouflage actually covers a couple of very different kinds of behavior. Because there's both the act of disappearing as such, but there's also many kinds of camouflage which are structured around trying to, as the term of art has it, hide a shape by filling it with hints of other possible shapes. And so numerous kinds of camouflage systems are based around the idea that, for example, it's not going to make you invisible, but it will make it so that if a sniper is trying to shoot you, it'll be harder to figure out exactly how far away you are and how fast you're moving and in exactly which way. And I clarify this because for us, there are many overlaps with camouflage, but part of the assumption of obfuscation is that you are already seen, you are already observed to some degree, and that there is some way that you can generate additional information as you are seen that will allow you to make it harder to distinguish the salient information. However,
but you cannot be observed as you construct these other traces.
Yes. Yeah, I guess that's a good question. I mean, it depends on the specific. I mean, if you think of the example of something like TrackMeNot, for example, or ad nauseum, it relies on the idea that the system doesn't actually observe you typing, for example. It's just, although again, we have to like generate things. I'm thinking of like the attempt to mask uploads to WikiLeaks and to related leak sites, which involved projects to try to figure out what the realistic upload traffic looked like, so that you could generate it client side and have it mask which people were actually uploading files to the site. So the assumption again is that you are being observed, but you're not being totally observed. That there is, yeah, exactly. There's some nature of the channel. However, there's a deeper point here that I want to very quickly hit on, which is that Hannah Rose Schell's fantastic book about camouflage that I encourage everyone to read, it's a marvelous book, is partially based on the idea that the history of camouflage is actually the history of surveillance technology as internalized by people who are trying to avoid it. That when you, don't just think about clothes, like, because one of her points is that camouflage is almost always about practices. It's not just what you wear, but it's about ways of moving, ways of acting, in a very real context, in the battlefield. And that each of those involves trying to mentally reverse engineer how you look from a plane, or how you look on video, or how you look through a scope, so that you can figure out how to sort of act against that. And in a similar way, part of what really fascinated me about the obfuscation project, working with Helen, was to look at how people had internalized mental models of how their data was being collected and used. To look at the ways in which people understood, however fallaciously, the nature of something like the query analysis algorithms, or the ways in which Facebook collected certain kinds of data, the ways in which they were observed, so that they could counteract that system. And for me, one of the areas of future inquiry, which is sort of the goal of this talk, is to press us to think in a less human fashion about how our data is of interest. To press us to think in ways that are perhaps more accurate to how the data is actually being collected, parsed, and so on, but which may resemble much less our traditional concerns about personally identifiable information. But yeah, it's very much about that camouflage and obfuscation are both very much about the process of trying to internalize, to model the nature of the surveillance process.
You're going to have to think, and if there are more questions, you're welcome
Yes,
to
or
join us
please
outside.
email me as well.
Thank you very much.